I think our main commitment is to leave the place where we live in a better shape that we found it. That was what my grandfather always say, and that is our goal. And here in Chiapas, in San Cristobal de las Casas, we have a farm. Mark Square has a farm. We are trying to do sustainable farming, restoring ecological systems. And actually, the next presentation is by John DeLiu, and it's a pre-record film that he sent specifically for this conference, and it's on ecosystem restoration camps. As you know, he is one of the champions on ecosystem restoration camps. He's the founder of this movement, and they have chapters around the world. And in California, they have several chapters as well. And well, we have now this video that's going to play in 2 seconds, I think.
Hello, I'm John Liu. I'm here at the Hotlam Ecosystem Restoration Camp on Mount Shasta in Northern California. I'm very grateful to the Common Land Foundation and to the Mustard Seed Trust for making it possible for me to continue to do this work. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk with you. I'd like to share a little bit about what I've been doing over the last 3 decades in studying ecology and evolution and in working in restoration around the world. If you've ever heard anything about my work, it's probably because of the restoration of the Loess Plateau in the upper and middle reaches of the Yellow River. Back in 1994, the World Bank asked me to go out and document the Loess Plateau. Loess is a soil type. It's a wind-borne sediment that's created by movements of glaciers high in the Himalayas and deposited on the plateau below. And what's interesting about this is that the area is the cradle of Chinese civilization. It's about 640,000 square kilometers, and it's the biggest deposits of loess. But because of where it is, if you dig around in there, you might find some really interesting things. Now, of course, China developed a very magnificent civilization, and it must have been really nurturing at one point. But when I got there, it looked completely devastated, like a desert. And it was hard to understand how could the largest ethnic group on the planet come from a place that looked like this. So I'm going to ask Jürgen Vogele from the World Bank to add what he thought when he first went out to the plateau and talk about the World Bank's position.
Now, when we came to this place in the Loess Plateau the first time, we were all really shocked. You know, we thought, oh my God, you know, well, how can ever anybody try to rehabilitate an area that is so huge and so fundamentally destroyed ecologically? And the truth is, we spent 2 years working with the local people, with the farmers, with the local officials, with the experts in the various fields of hydrology, soil and water conservation, forestry, agriculture, environment, try to understand what it would take to do something like this. And after 2 years, we still didn't have many answers. The World Bank didn't have the answer, and the local people didn't have the answer. And we spent another 1.5 years talking to the farmers in the villages, trying to understand what they had done in the past 20 or 30 years that was successful. And it was really interesting. Not much was there to show, because the current practices at that time were just not sustainable at all.
So, in going out there to film the original baseline study, I was fascinated by this place where my ancestors came from. And I was thrown in with the experts from the Water Ministry, the Academy of Sciences, the international consultants who were working on this. And I began to see that the degradation was caused by certain things. And I started to see what was being lost. The hydrological cycle was completely disrupted. And instead of infiltrating water, the water was flowing away and taking the soil with it. And when this happens at scale, it's very dramatic. There were huge amounts of sediments. It was the most eroded place on Earth. And it had been for a very long time. This was quite an extraordinary outcome. And as I followed this, I saw that this caused massive disruptions, flooding, huge flooding. And it was also the actually 1,500 times in recorded history there were floods. And this is a strange phenomenon where the sediments are so enormous that it creates this kind of weird thing that tourists come to look at. And of course, there were these massive dust storms. And this was sort of endemic for a long time in China. And the sediments go all around the world as a sediment layer in the atmosphere.
This is China's Lus Plateau. Until recently, this was one of the poorest regions in the country. A land renowned for floods, mudslides, and famine. But with the fanfare comes the hope of change for the better. My name is John D. Liu. I've been documenting the changes on the plateau for 15 years. I first came here in 1995 to film an ambitious project where local people were constructing a new landscape on a vast scale. Transforming a barren land into a green and fertile one. The project certainly changed my life, convincing me to become a soil scientist. The lessons I've learned in the last few years have made me realize that many of the human tragedies that we regularly witness around the world, the floods, mudslides, droughts, and famines, are not inevitable. Here on the Lus Plateau, I've witnessed that people can lift themselves out of poverty. They can radically improve their environment, and by doing so, reduce the threat of climate change. One thing that became apparent early on is the connection between damaged environments and human poverty. In many parts of the world, there's been a vicious cycle. Continuous use of the land has led to subsistence agriculture, and generation by generation, this has further degraded the soils. The vital question we have to ask is, can this destructive process be reversed? When I first filmed Mr. Ta Fuyuan and his colleagues back in 1995, I had no idea this initiative could achieve such dramatic results. The effort that people put into converting their slopes into terraces has resulted in a marked increase in agricultural productivity. The higher yields are directly related to the return of natural vegetation in the surrounding ecological land. As a result of its success, the lessons learned from the Loess Plateau rehabilitation are now being applied all over China. But could such projects work elsewhere in less centrally controlled societies, with fewer resources and different soils? Ethiopia, perhaps more than any other country, has come to symbolize the vulnerability of humankind to environmental catastrophe. This is a country whose problems have been increased by war and civil conflict. And now, human-induced climate change is predicted to make matters worse. As on the Loess Plateau, centuries of subsistence farming practices have stripped the land of natural vegetation. The dry gullies bear the scars of flash floods.
These gullies are evidence of the enormous power of runoff during the rainy season. Without vegetation cover on the hillsides, when the rains come, the water doesn't soak into the ground but flows away in a flood. Then it's not available for agriculture during the rest of the year. This leads to drought, and famously for Ethiopia, famine.
But just as I've witnessed in China, there is hope that the situation here can be reversed. In just 6 years, Professor Legessa Nagash and local villagers have transformed a severely eroded terrain by planting indigenous trees and plants. Almost miraculously, a clear flowing stream has emerged where once there was a muddy trickle.
How is it that it's possible for you to get the stream to flow throughout the year?
It is because of the vegetation cover, which has been regenerating on this mountain. This water is maintained in the landscape because as soon as rain falls on the canopy on this vegetation, that rain then infiltrated gradually into the ground, ending up with this steady flow of this river.
If we were to restore the vast areas of the planet where we humans have degraded the soils, just think what an impact we would have in taking carbon out of the atmosphere. As much as a quarter of the world's landmass has been degraded, and much could be rehabilitated in the way we have seen on the Loess Plateau. And we've only just begun to recognize the real value of natural capital. Surely investing in the recovery of damaged environments is a cost-effective way of solving many of the problems we face today.
What we've seen in China, in Africa, and around the world is that it's possible to rehabilitate large-scale damaged ecosystems. If we can transfer the capital, the technology, and empower the local people to restore their own environment, it'll have enormous benefits. Restoration can sequester carbon, reduce biodiversity loss, mitigate against flooding, drought, and famine. It can ensure food security for people who are now chronically hungry. Why don't we do this on a global scale? My experiences have made me very philosophical, especially about evolution. And I realized that what I understand about this is that when the Earth formed, it was a molten rock surrounded by poisonous gases, or at least gases that we couldn't breathe. And then these were transformed, and the Earth was transformed by biological life into a beautiful garden. And the process that drove this transformation was a biochemical photoreactive process, and the constant differentiation and speciation leading to infinite potential variety in genetics. And that the constant accumulation of organic material as each generation of life died and gave up its body, is the basis of the various systems that we rely on for life. Essentially, the principles that emerged that I saw were biodiversity, biomass, and accumulated organic matter. And that these are the processes, or these are the principles which created, constantly filter, and continuously renew the atmosphere, the hydrological cycle, the soil fertility. And it was interesting to realize, too, that this is very similar to the Judeo-Christian Islamic cosmology, because in this, human beings emerge in paradise. And when human beings emerge in paradise, something happens, because at first we're prey, but then we transform into predators. And I think we studied other social hunting animals, and we learned to be very good at hunting. And our first huge impacts were to drive megafauna to extinction. Now, this is simply a cat video to make you like me. But it also shows how beautiful it is in the wild. This is in the Masai Mara. It's a cheetah nursing its cubs in the wild. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to go and see this type of thing. Now, when I realized that it was at the time of settled agriculture that we really began to alter the earth, because evolution had always more biodiversity, always more biomass, always more accumulated organic matter, and we began to reduce biodiversity, reduce biomass, and reduce accumulated organic matter. And ultimately, this leads to collapsed ecosystems. And I've seen this now in all continents. So basically, all the cradles of civilization have been massively disrupted by human impacts. And always the conditions are the same. Huge sedimentation, loss of biodiversity, loss of biomass, and then ultimately hydrological disruptions, soil infertility, and collapse. And every civilization that followed this scenario went in the same way. So I started to consider, what am I seeing? And I realized I was only seeing two states, functional or dysfunctional ecosystems. And functional systems are definitely the ones that we want, and dysfunctional ones are definitely what we don't want. And I noticed that, like in the Loess Plateau, it started with a pristine system, and then as the civilization grew up, it was destroying by reducing biodiversity, biomass, and accumulated organic matter. But what's interesting about the Chinese scenario is it made an intervention, and that intervention is the paradigm shift, because it leads to a different outcome. And the systems can be restored even over large areas and over large historical time periods. So this is what we need to do. And then the question that arose was, well, why does this happen? The world is facing multiple problems. We have biodiversity loss, climate change, desertification, food insecurity, poverty, disparity, and now the threat of financial collapse. It seems like there are two conversations going on. One in the developed world, which is talking about economics and technical solutions, and another one in the developing world, which is talking about survival and sustainability. I've begun to see this differently. When it comes to survival and sustainability, there's only one story for the human species, and we're all in this together. All our problems are interrelated. Far from being mysterious, they're actually the logical outcomes of the type of economic system that we've created. And this also seems to point toward the solution. We know when we see a forest, a lake, the ocean, a natural river system, the atmosphere, that it's more valuable than computers, cars, or airplanes, which are valuable for a short time, but then become trash and pollution. Natural systems are renewable. They've evolved over billions of years, and they are infinitely valuable. Now, the global economy values production and consumption. And although few understand it, speculation. This has suggested the finite derivatives shaped from the Earth's natural systems are somehow more valuable than the infinitely renewable systems themselves. This is simply wrong. We need to admit that we made this mistake. If we were to truly value natural systems, then nature would become the basis of our money and our economy. To protect nature, then, would not be a luxury, but a necessity. This brings us much closer to the truth, because we must have water, air, and fertile soils. But we just want computers, cars, and airplanes. We can change. It will not be easy, but we can and we must do it. I think there are two possibilities. If we are thoughtful and do the right thing, then we can consciously transition to a new paradigm in which human actions and the natural environment are in harmony. The other possibility is that the current system implodes from its own corruption and mistakes, and we are forced to try to salvage whatever we can of human civilization. For the sake of the children and future generations of life, we need to consciously decide to do the right thing. When we do that, we'll understand that wealth is coming from natural ecosystem function. And this will be the basis of our money. And all human actions will go to conserving and protecting and restoring ecological function on Earth. We need to shift societal intent away from the production and consumption and waste of the economic system as we see it now, and realize that wealth is coming from natural ecosystem function. If we run out of water, if we run out of fertile soils, if we run out of air, if we alter the climate, our money is worthless. We have to understand that the true wealth on the earth is coming from natural ecological function. And if we do this, if we choose this, then our money and our economy will reflect that. And all human activity will go toward conservation and, wherever the land is degraded, restoration. Because that's the way to protect wealth, and that's the way to increase wealth. Well, all of this has led me to wonder, what is possible? And this area that I'm showing you now is the Taklamakan Desert. It means you go in, but you don't come out. And even here, the Chinese have built a shelter belt through the middle of this, 426 kilometers through the middle of the second largest shifting sand desert in the world. And when you measure the differences between temperatures, it's extraordinary. You have 45 degrees centigrade differences in the surface of the sand and below the vegetative canopy. So this tells us a huge amount of what is possible. And it also shows that almost nothing is impossible. And I started to realize as I traveled around the world and looked at these places that actually it's human beings who are doing this. And if this is the intention of human civilization, then we can all work for restoration, and that this is way more valuable than working for materialism to buy and sell things or to aggregate, material things to individuals, and that many people who have lost their human rights could participate in this movement. And this has made me realize that this is the great work of our time, and that we must make this shift. And we must understand that the natural systems, the symbiosis between all the various systems, that is where the true value is. That is where wealth and health and sustainability are. And it's also beautiful and fascinating. So for me, I've been very fortunate and been able to spend decades now studying and documenting and observing and contemplating this. And I realized we're all Africans. We're all related to one another. And not only are we related to each other, but we're related to all living things. And this has changed my perspective and made me understand that there's nothing else that I need to do other than continue this path of learning and healing and sharing this. And that finally, we're stardust. We're connected to all life since the beginning of time. It can't be any other way. And so I created something called the Ecosystem Restoration Camps Movement. You can look at all my writings and films. They're all collected at that site. But the most exciting thing for me now is the ecosystem restoration camps, and I'm actually in a camp now, living in a tent. I'm at the Earth Teach Park near Ashland, Oregon. I've been with a fascinating group of people led by the Community Woodlands Ecosystem Restoration Camp. This is so important because this biome is still somewhat intact, but it's threatened with biodiversity loss from climate change, from new diseases and new pests. We all need to learn about this because this is where the water coming from the Pacific Ocean is absorbed into the biomass and into the soils and into the ground, and where it's respirated back into the atmosphere, and the lower hydrological cycle is regulated. And this is the natural regulation for the water cycle, for the weather and the climate throughout the west of the United States and beyond. And ecosystem restoration camps are forming here and all over the world so that ordinary people can do extraordinary things by restoring ecological function on a planetary scale. I really hope that you'll consider becoming a supporting member of the Ecosystem Restoration Camps movement. Many people are sharing $5 or $10 a month. Others with more resources are sharing more. But we can all do something. We can become sustaining members, we can create camps, and we can go camping. Together with our families and our friends, we can all work to restore the earth. I'm John Liu. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you so much again. Have a good night.